Thank you very much. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, on that note, let's get started with our next set of plenary sessions. And first up, ladies and gentlemen, we have with us our speaker, who's an internationally acclaimed landscape designer, an award-winning one, may I remind you all. In fact, she's also designed numerous high-profile projects, including the NYC's Queen's Plaza, India's Shillong Retreat and Institute, and also the pioneering Living Water Park in Chengdu, China. Ladies and gentlemen, her work exists across the crossroads of design, as well as ecology, urban planning, and architecture. We're truly delighted to have her presence this morning with us. So please put your hands together to welcome on stage Margie Ruddick, the owner of Margie Ruddick Landscape. Warm welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, to have been invited by Mr. Ozzy Pereira and the Pune chapter of LAI, also with whom I've worked for over 20 years in the Western Ghats. Also delighted to be among so many Canadians. I was born in Canada, grew up in New York City, and still live there. But very often, when people ask me, I've gotten this reputation for doing work that is wild landscape, so I used it for the title of my book. But people say to me, how did you get this fixation on wild things? And I say that often it's me going off in search of my inner Canadian. And I think as of November 9th, 2017, there are hordes of Americans now desperately going off in search of their inner Canadian. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Next. Thank you. Yeah, but is it going? It's not going. We didn't check that. And this is my entire presentation. There we go. How is it working now? Okay.
I have a name for which is called the hybrid.
What we do as landscape designers and urban planners and architects is to try to make things better. Quite often, this is Queen's Plaza, huge tangle of infrastructure, very dangerous. Thank you. Very, very dangerous place where people, it's called the Boulevard of Death because people actually often can't get across the street. So in 2003, we were hired by the Department of City Planning to transform it, and this is what we did to green it, green the infrastructure. It's an elevated train, cars, everybody going up to the Queensboro Bridge. Nobody was living nearby. It was very prohibitive, and people did not want to walk through and couldn't find their way. So what we did is make it hospitable, welcoming, and I've been thinking a lot in this amazing conference about what the value is. What is the value of what we do? Well, yesterday we heard people question, do we do things because they're good or because it's appropriate? In this case, it's very good. Ecosystem services is very high. It reduces the amount of flooding. It cleans the water as it goes into the sewer system and into our rivers. It sequesters carbon, planting, but as we heard yesterday, emissions cannot be met by just planting, so we've reduced the number of cars people now commute in and out of New York City along the bike lanes that we provided. It promotes biodiversity, which has many, many benefits. But I was thinking about the happiness quotient, which was brought up yesterday, and I kept wanting to stand up because I actually, 2 years ago, when the list came out of the happiest nations on the planet, it was really interesting to read that Vanuatu was one of them in the South Pacific, and Colombia, South America. And the common denominator of most of the top 6, it wasn't, cars, phones, being rich. It was feeling part of a community and also feeling connected to nature. Those were the 2 things that came up over and over again. And you can see in both cultures how connected to nature they are. And landscape does that. We can do that in the middle of a city. We can make a place that is infrastructure. It's a place for people actually to live. It's a place where community can actually gather. Students, workers, residents, and understanding that there's no such thing as one community. It's layers and layers and layers of different communities that all exist together. And we're introducing nature in the city in a way that feels natural. It feels like the city is a place of nature. So I went looking for an image where you don't have, we were told it has to feel like it's Queens. Queens, one of the 6 or whatever most happy cities, as we heard yesterday. And it has to feel of Queens. It's gritty, it's somewhat industrial. So I went to find an image. I would like to ask if anybody has any idea where this is. This is the sort of standard that we're delivered over and over again, the world over, sort of hacienda. So can anybody say what country this is in? Where? Arizona. Arizona is a desert. Arizona is the home of the Grand Canyon. How is it that there's no sense of the desert, and there's also no sense of where people would exist in this landscape? And this is what I think the field and this entire group gathered here today is trying to do. And it's not just about the desert, it's about the ecological world. It's about the social world. Where are people living in outdoor spaces, and how are they interacting, and how are they moving? And then the economic part, which was why I was so happy to be invited here, because it's the invisible backbone of landscape architecture. Without thinking through the economics, not just in terms of who's going to pay for this, but how is this actually going to generate income? How is this actually going to be self-sustaining? Economics is everything. And each one of these projects, I'm just going to show you 3 projects. Each one is different. Each one is conceived as a very, very different kind of landscape. And I'm here really as a guest of people I've worked with for a long, long time. I'm not here as an international person to come in. And I would like to warn people against that parachuting kind of design and planning where people come in, design something. We heard yesterday how design needs to grow from the community up. And each one of these projects is different. So if somebody tries to sell you a formula, or somebody you're working with, I think that it's the thing to avoid. In this case, we conceived of it as a hub. It's a transit hub. It's got trains, it's got buses, it's got people commuting, and it's also a cultural hub. Long Island City has PS1. It had MoMA for a while, Museum of Modern Art. So it's very much an artist community and a hub. So how do we make that livable? And how do we make all of those things collapse into such a small space? Well, this is the elevated train, and this guy, after we did our work, is sitting in peace, but the elevated train actually makes this horrific noise that people call the screech. You can see that there are taxis right behind him, like 30 feet behind him, but the planting actually dampened the noise 23%. So it went from being like standing in the middle of a street in the middle of Mumbai to being like out on the street here, which is livable. So planting and landscape can make a place livable, and then also more safe. So in this, you can see people can actually cross the street now, rest. Before they had to run across 9 lanes. People are commuting in and out of the city on the bike lanes that go through the medians. So this was occasioned by rezoning. People don't just do landscape projects because people say, oh, let's find the money to do a nice landscape. Usually there's something, whether it's a rezoning or an infrastructure project that actually trigger a landscape project. So this is a rezoning of Queens Plaza to be the 4th business hub of New York City. And so we actually worked with the Department of Transportation to redo all of the lanes and all of the traffic. So that was essential. And you can see how it really works. So this is everything that it does good. You know, it prevents 20.2 million gallons of water from going into the sewers and into the rivers every year. It reduces irrigation needs. It stores carbon. It's not a huge amount of carbon to store, by the way. So that reducing driving is much, much more important. And then it also reduced the noise. But what it really did was made people happy just to ride their bicycles through the space. You see people all the time, kids, mothers, students, just relaxing, and it's incredible in the middle of all of this movement for them to actually find respite. It also brought in a lot of money. It attracted over 10 new international tenants, including JetBlue, MetLife, It triggered over 5,000 new rental and condominium units that are being infill around the neighborhood. 20 plus hotels all of a sudden are in Long Island City. So it actually really promoted development, but the development is very site-specific, place-specific, very, very in keeping with Queens, that kind of gritty. So it's not that what we saw, is it India, is it Arizona? It's not that placeless kind of development. It's very community-oriented. People feel very at home here. So the second project I wanted to mention is in Cheongju, the capital of Sichuan. Very, very different conception of open space. This is a city of now like 13 million people where the waterfront had been completely deserted. It was a waste site. And Betsy Damon, the artist up in the upper right, asked me to come. She was an artist doing a lot of water quality sort of installations, and she asked me to come design the Living Water Park, a park that would demonstrate how water can be cleaned biologically, so through settlement, through plants, filtering all the contaminants, and through aeration. So I went for 1 month in 1996 and worked with a team. And what I did was facilitate. And quite often, what we can do is help facilitate a local team that is not together yet. Somebody comes in from outside and they can actually help the team organize and get a direction. And then also make some broad design guidelines, sort of focus the design work. So that's what we did. It was, the entire waterfront was being demolished. It was quite painful because it was beautiful, but it was not livable. No water, and there was no wastewater treatment for the whole city. So they sacrificed all the housing on the waterfront to do 90 miles of new waterfront park to actually bury all the infrastructure for a new wastewater treatment. So now all of the water in the city actually is cleaned. It's made a huge, huge difference to the quality of life. So this is a living water park. We went, so what I did was go, also sometimes you can point to the things locally that are great. So we went to the rice fields, all in the paddies around, and we just adopted the way that rice fields actually are graduated to filter the water. So it doesn't look like anything I'd done before. It's much more organic looking, but it's from the place. And you can see how this, it feels, you're in the city, but it feels miles away. So this was a little uncomfortable with the design because it's also kind of, one of my architect friends, when I came back, he said, too bad you can never publish this project because it looks like lava. But this is what it looked like 15 years later. And you can see, actually, if you go back to this, you can see that the waterfront was pretty derelict in terms of businesses. And 15 years later, a lot of development had already reached this intense new sort of, the waterfront parks, I think, are the kind of central park of the 21st century. We don't have the room anymore in the cities. It's the slivers, it's the infrastructure, it's all the places where you can actually make the lungs of the city. So, but this is a refuge. Queens Plaza is a hub. This is a place, it's a wildlife refuge. I'm sorry, this is after the water has all been cleaned through all the settlement, and actually people can wade in this water. So it's educational as well. And you can see here, it's a place of respite where one person can go and feel completely away, but it's also a cultural and social place. People go and take their wedding pictures. People play games. People do Tai Chi. Musicians come and just sit there all day playing together. But it's very much of Cheongju. We spent a lot of time looking at how parks are designed there, and they're masters, so why not deploy? So I left after a month. I think the best thing I did for that project was leave, and the landscape architects who were there and the architects all had formed a team, and they took the design all the way through construction, and it's very beautiful. It's won a lot of awards. And this is one of Betsy Damon's flow forms. So kids spent hours at these flow forms, not just having fun, but learning, physics, learning about water. And this is that pool where it's cleaned, where it's a place where people come down. And you'll see that the river stone and the materials are very much of the city. So it kind of grew organically through this process. I actually threw this project in after yesterday about public-private partnerships. This is Governor's Island. We were one of the finalists for the competition to redo Governor's Island and decommission Coast Guard station. And how do you transform this into 80 acres, the south part, all in the background? How do you transform it to 80 acres of park, 20 acres of new development? So often they'll say, okay, well, the development goes here and the park goes here, and people put everything in boxes, and the bubble diagram is our enemy because it segregates everything. We need things that are three-dimensional to look at how all of these different components actually are interacting. So this was the design. I don't know if there's a... so the parkland is 80 acres. There were tons of buildings that needed to come down. We said, let's make a hill in the bottom and a ravine to make a little more sheltered waterway. The harbor is very dangerous here, so you can't kayak there. The currents are tremendous. So, and then there's the development, sort of light industrial art space on the right. And then we proposed actually bringing some of those buildings. That arc is actually a farm. It's actually, we said, well, rather than thinking of these as separate, why don't you ask the developers to build farms on the second story? So they will actually build another 20 acres of parkland. And the Parks Department, or whoever, the organization will maintain it, because you can't ask the developers actually to maintain it. So what we do is say, how do you leverage developers to actually build and actually create a sense of life to the place? And then this was a kind of an Aman-like resort. We said, instead of asking in your RFP to do a signature building, or why don't you make them embed the building and create this new topography? So they'll create the hills that make the ravine. Now they can have a private little waterway, but here where it's public, kids can learn how to kayak. They can actually have summer camps. So you're leveraging the developer to create the topography that creates this new amenity that you don't have on this pancake flat island. And then Coney Island is a project in, I don't know, those of you who know what Coney Island is, the amusement park of New York City, and everybody thinks of it as Coney Island is all these amusements, but it's actually a very challenged neighborhood. You see here, all the waterfront was the dumping ground, so they put public housing on the waterfront, this amazing Atlantic Ocean beach. And it's quite dangerous. This is more, those of you who live around New York City, this is the image of Coney Island, is, police tape and trash. So we were asked, and we won the competition, to redo the perimeter of the New York Aquarium. And this is what it looked like. New York City, because of politics, has not built this. But in most projects that I see now, development projects, we saw in the Mumbai project yesterday, there is the signature, called like the Bilbao project, that is the project that's going to kind of be the flashy thing that's going to help transform a neighborhood. So I thought, this can't be a landscape project. I was invited because they thought of it as a landscape project. I thought, what we really need here, so the landscape is very serviceable. Let's bring dunes out to the beach. Let's do new tidal pools on the water. But that wouldn't really address the problem that it's not engaged in Coney Island. Coney Island is sort of lost a little bit. So we said it needs to be an amusement like the Cyclone, which is the roller coaster, or the parachute jump. It needs to be another in that family. So I invited Enrique Ruiz-Gelli, a Barcelona architect, who's known for doing these scrims of light. And we worked together on doing this overarching web that was very much based on research on marine life, but 40,000 LEDs, solar-powered LEDs, would glow either red or blue depending on how much light there is. So it really is a beacon. So we looked at how fish skin works. It moves, it communicates, and we said, this is what the web is going to do, and it's going to gather Coney Island, the aquarium, but it's also going to celebrate the city and this amazing waterfront. So we said, okay, this is how skin works, this is how architecture works, and then this is how the web is going to work. It's going to do all these things, including communicate. And these are the solar-powered LEDs, very much like whale sharks and other bioluminescent fish. And other species. So this is the before on top, what it looks like now. So that's the aquarium now. Who would know that there are sharks and octopus and other animals right there? And this is what it would look like afterwards. So I think of this. The first was the hub. The second was the refuge. This is the Bilbao project, where you say you've got to just pull out all the stops and make something really spectacular. So I wanted to end talking about Shillem, the project that I've been working on with Ozzy and Ryder Corporation since 1997. It's 2,500 acres in the Western Ghats, the Western Ghats being a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the Conservation International hotspots for biodiversity. It's one of the great cat ranges in the world, big cat ranges in the world. And it's under a lot of threat from development, from speculation, from that sort of placeless, universal holiday villa. They will buy it, they will put a fence around it, they will irrigate it, and it will be theirs, and then they'll look out at this magnificent landscape. So they wanted to start, they were sort of visionary in 1997, they wanted to sort of combat that and say, let's do a project that really is about this landscape. So I have to say that Ozzy kept me from being fired many, many times on this job because we said, Stephen Harris, the architect, and Vrinda Khanna and I said, you need to disperse the program and have this entire project. And I apologize, I know we're talking about urban projects. This is very remote, but it's the same issues over and over again, which are to actually connect, like we connected Coney Island, the aquarium, to Coney Island. We wanted to connect this to the huge corridors beyond the site. And the Sahyadri Range, which this is part of, is a jewel of the Western Ghats. There's an intense forest, very, very diverse, healthy forest on the site. We said it's a no-go zone. Protect the forest. 28 tributaries all going down to this major nala that goes out to a man-made large Pauna Lake. But really understand the waterways. There are cultural landscapes, including all of the rice fields that have been farmed for generations. And then there's a community. There is a community living in the site, about 100 people, and how to actually engage the people who live there from the beginning so that it's not coming in, wiping out what people do, wiping out communities for a resort. That's sort of like what happens over and over. People say eco-resort, and all of a sudden you say, well, what was here before? And there are also sacred places. There are sacred groves in the forest. This is a plateau where we cited this, quote, spiritual retreat. Stephen Harris and I had a big fight because he wanted to build a building there, and I said, there can't be a building up there. And I won, but it was because, not on the merits at all, it was because they just said, this is just going to be too hard to build up there. So I was happy, but yesterday we heard about incrementalization. Coming in from America, it's all community meetings and everything. I kept saying to Ozzy and to Denzel D'Souza, so when are you actually going to talk to the village? And, don't you need a meeting with them? And they kept saying, just, leave it. Just don't worry about that now. And I was quite worried. So in 2003, we decided to do a tremendous amount of reforestation because there was a lot of we wanted to cite all of the dispersed program when I finally was not fired and we got to disperse the program. We wanted to cite it in all of the disturbed areas, so the eroded slopes and the rice fields. So there was a lot of reforestation needed, and so writers started a nursery just off the site. And the horticulturists who were actually running the nursery started to hang out with the people in the village, and they said, in fact, the water source for the village is kind of far, and they spent a lot of time going back and forth to do their washing and to get water. So why don't we build a dam? Just bring it 100 feet closer. And that was a project that they did together, and then all of a sudden there was a team. I mean, there already had been people in the village were the guards. They were our people who we walked with and really knew better than the survey what was going on in the land. But all of a sudden, one project actually galvanized a team, and that's something that I've used over and over and over again. You don't just go in and say, oh, everybody work together. You just say, okay, we have one problem to solve, so let's solve this, and then people start to learn how to work together. So it's a very dry site and inundated in the monsoon. It has all of these different little symbols are the different, like the orchids and edible forest and all of the different places that you can walk. So this is the spa. This is the idea of spa. Not that you go and have a treatment, but that you go out into the landscape. And this is how all of the development is aggregated in the rice fields and on these slopes that were eroded through grazing, collecting for fuel. But how do you actually insert 100 rooms and all of these things into this landscape and make it look like nothing happened. That was a big job. This is what it looked like when we got there. All of those slopes had been grazed, and after all of the reforestation, that's what it looks like now. That's from the club. We did thousands of meters of contour trenching, slowing the water down so that all of that reforestation, all the vegetation could actually take root. So this is before, and this is after just stopping grazing. Just stopping grazing actually created a whole rich matrix of meadow and now forest. So building on the expertise, the first people who came in that were actually my team thought they knew what they were doing in terms of planting. Well, people here knew much better how to make plants grow that can survive in a desert and can survive in a flood. Scale, whether you're in a city or whether you're here, is so critical. So we were really mindful of not blowing out the scale. So the architects made the buildings very light, and their roofs are faceted so that they don't feel like these things kind of plunked down. Sited quite often on the slopes. This is the club, sited around a big mango tree and a ravine. Each one of these projects is sited differently in terms of how it's, this is the spa, which actually acts as a dam. And this is one of those, not Bilbao quality, but one of those moments where it really needs to read out as this is a special architectural thing and man-made thing floating within this. And this is one of the pools that's just sort of slipped into the mountain forest. And the buildings, the rooms, each have a different quality. This is on a bench, feels like a village room. This is the forest suite, which was a type that they wanted, and so we actually grew the forest up to meet the suite. This was not forested, 20 years ago. Organic farming has shifted from rice, which is not really that remunerative right now, to a higher grade of farming, and also over 7 years, leaving pesticides and everything, it has become actually organic. But the heart of it is the Shillem Institute, which turns this place, it's not just a resort. One of the changes in customer or guests is that people don't necessarily just want to go hang out at the pool, they want to be engaged. A certain echelon of tourists now is called the active rich, or the new leisure, where you can go to a conference. The first conference we wanted to do was on waste, which has been brought up a lot. And also, they can paint, they can actually take night walks out in the forest to see wildlife. So everything really revolves around being in the landscape. All of the landscape spaces, really, there are no bounded gardens. It's all about feeling part of the bigger landscape. So this image is really integrating what I think is really important, understanding culture, there's building, there's domestication, that's all new planting in the foreground, that's all conservation in the background. How do we actually knit all of these things together so that people really understand that when you're in the middle of the city, you're in the middle of nature. When you're out in the forest, you're actually part of culture. Thank you very much. I'm very excited to see the next presentation. Are there questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Tejashree. We met yesterday.
Yes.
And my question to you is, while planting or reforestation, do you make it sure to plant indigenous or local variety of plants? Or you even consider planting exotic or foreign varieties?
This has been an issue on every single project, which is that there's a huge excellent movement to make everything native, but sometimes there are plants that are not invasive, that are culturally important, that operate, for instance, to give you shade. A lot of native plants are great for wildlife. They're great because they feel great. You feel part of the landscape. They're very slow growing, so if you want something very quick, you plant something exotic as long as it's not invasive and it doesn't actually take way more resources. So I'm not a purist. when you talk about sustainability, I think anybody who's like a purist in terms of sustainability isn't going to do well. Everything is a hybrid. So you take a bit of this, you take a bit of that, and then you say, what are the costs here? What are the benefits? And as long as the benefits are, enough, then you do it. But I use exotic plants all the time. I did a water garden in Miami Beach where it would have been ridiculous to use native plants. It would have been like a little postcard zoo. Okay.
We do have room for another question, so if you may please raise your hand, we'll have the mic passed on to you.
I'm Roland Mendonça, an architect. I was very happy and pleased to know that you're doing so much work there at Shillem.
Yeah.
I happened to be there with Ozzy and Denzel so many years ago.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Thank you for reviving those memories.
Right.
On a professional front, as you mentioned, there's always this tussle that goes on between the landscape architect and the building architect. Who should get more land?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Now, you got that?
The architect and
The landscape architect and the building architect,
Yes, right.
just to separate the two,
Right.
always fight for the greater piece of the land.
they're choosing the wrong partners.
No, I'm talking about the percentage of the land that the architect wants to build upon and the landscape architect would like to have. Now, in Shillem, you mentioned it's close to 2,500 acres. In a city like Mumbai, where land is so scarce, and we are talking about raising the FSI, as an experienced landscape architect, what is your need, what is your requirement per person for an actual space of the ground area? Today we have got more landscape on top of the buildings than we do at the actual level of the earth.
It's so site-specific. Somebody asked me today, why are there no benches out in the parks? Well, there are people sitting along the seashore on rocks, bulkhead, because it's cool. You know, it's beautiful. But if you put 1 million benches in one of these interior, really hot parks, nobody would sit there. So I think it's very, very site-specific. And sometimes somebody asked me to do a project in Juhu, fly all the way to Mumbai. I said, you just get a local horticulturist and just plant the heck out of it. You don't need me to design anything fancy. It just needs to be shady. And if you want me to send you some details, but I just think that it's so site-specific. But in the States, where it's much less extreme, because it's kind of pleasant to be outside in the spring and the fall, we actually have standards of how many acres per person. But I'm terrible with numbers, so I'm not going. How many acres of parkland per person? And we do go by those guidelines. We try to meet the minimum and try to up it, because there, people are living in apartments, and there are a lot of, people really have a lot of stuff to do outside in those 2 seasons. But in the winter and in the summer, it's too hot and too cold, and people often don't use these spaces. So it's really seasonal, and it's really specific to exactly where it is in terms of climate.
We have a question here. So do you have a question? We do have a question. Let's have the mic passed on. I believe there's another question from the gentleman here as well. We do, all right. So we'll just accommodate the 2 questions quickly.
First of all, congratulations. I think it was a wonderful presentation for all of us. And like you rightly said, most people in cities, one of the most important points they look at for the feel-good factor is the landscape.
Right.
That's what makes people happy. So now taking forward his question, with the urban congestion, it's very difficult for people like you to have the creativity and the space. But taking it forward, I was having a chat over breakfast
It's
with
key.
the next speaker, Bebop,
Yeah.
where I feel like all of us, I'm also looking forward to hearing him,
Yeah.
where you both could connect.
Yeah.
Is Bebop told me a very interesting concept where a very big developer in California has bought land in the middle of nowhere. Now, he bought it cheap, but what he wants Bebop to do is to connect that land with the central of LA and see that all these chaps who are living in small houses can reach there in 15 minutes.
Right.
Now, that's where you come in.
Right.
With this expanse of land available to people like you and with him to ensure that people go from A to B within few minutes, it will be a game changer for you as well as him.
Is it near Palm Springs, Coachella, that area? Like, okay, so it's really far. Because I'm doing a project in Coachella, like Palm Springs, where the architects who I brought in, I mean, it's an architecture project, so the architects I brought in actually refused even to go after the project because they said, it's in the middle of this industrial area that has nothing to do with the desert, it's only an amusement, it's actually a surf park with a wave machine. And I said, well, why don't we think about it instead of thinking it's just going to be an amusement park with, like an imposition. Why don't we say we'll do this if you let us completely redo the desert landscape there has wetlands. The desert landscape there has palm forests. So if you actually conceive of this new program within the desert landscape and you actually do restoration, this would be a restoration project, then, I don't know if this answers your question, it just made me think of, but to me, the space in the city in really, really congested places means that we have to completely integrate infrastructure and greening. There's like, we're not making parks here. Okay. Okay.
I think, first, Margie, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
I think we need more people with your vision. And it's extremely important to actually start to think about the mistakes that we did, okay?
Yeah.
There are two orders of problem. The first one, how we build our cities around cars.
Yeah.
And this is a craziness. When I'm speaking about humanizing transportation is because we need to rethink how we build the cities.
Right.
And I think the role of technologies, it's really important. I haven't seen it in your presentation, but I'm sure you are working on it, because now we have technology like hydroponic or aeroponic that actually can change completely how we build cities.
Right.
We can actually embed the natural element inside building and regain the space. But I think the most important, and I want to see your opinion, thing is to actually start to reverse the cementification and start to use technology to actually reconceive our cities.
Right.
And that's the most important role that you play in this game.
I didn't show one project that's an interior project that's at the Bank of America building, which is Bryant Park, which is now like a circus, So Bryant Park is no longer a refuge. It's Fashion Week or it's whatever. So I did an interior where we went up vertically, did vertical sculptures where you feel like you're in a fern canyon. And people, it's actually now, I was surprised of all my projects, it's the one that's in Great Urban Spaces book, and it's an interior project. And people go from all over to have lunch there. And when you walk in, it's quiet. People say, I feel better when I'm in here. And I think that understanding that we had to build a completely artificial structure to do that inside, but that they feel like they're in nature is really interesting. That nature has antidepressant qualities, air scrubbing. If you look at health and how much just being around one plant or plants actually increases your health, that really understanding how to build that into the city. And the vertical, like 20 years ago, people were saying, oh, I did a vertical tower with garden stuff, and everybody was like, it's like a cartoon. And it was, because I'm not an architect, but now they're being built. Vertical gardens, forests in the interior. So I think really understanding, And people say, oh, it can't be done structurally. Well, it totally can be done structurally. So I'm all with you. Thank you.
We'll take one last question, ma'am. We have one last question as well.
Good morning, ma'am.
Hello.
My name is Jay Warren. I'm an architect. And I've been a big fan of your work since a very long time.
Oh, thank you.
And if I'm not wrong, like you actually were fined by Philadelphia Code for adding too much nature in the city.
I didn't understand what
If I'm not wrong, you were fined by the Philadelphia Code for adding
yes,
too
I was
much
fined.
nature in the city.
I was fined for growing weeds in my front yard.
Yeah, so my question would be like, what would your ideal point would be of adding nature in the city? Like as Sir said about hydroponic garden, especially in a city like Mumbai, where the open spaces and the garden area is actually comparatively much less than what is required.
Right.
So what would your idea of nature would be in a city like Mumbai?
I think there's so many ways. I mean, just you could do a huge catalog in the building, on the street. I do think parks need to be thought through programmatically, not just to be green spaces, but to be event spaces, places where people work, so that it actually really is a living kind of a thing. But I think that it can be inserted into every single part of the city, including underground. There's a low line in New York. I've always been skeptical because I grew up in the subway. So I've always been like, oh my God, I don't want to go down there. But the low line now has gotten funding to do with light reflectors that bring the light in from above into an old subway space to make a park to meet the High Line. So I think that there's no end of where you can put life.
Well, thank you very much, ma'am. If I may request you to remain on the stage, I'd like to invite Oswald Pereira, Secretary OMLAI, to please come on the stage and present a token of gratitude to Margie Ruddick. If I may please invite you, sir, to please come on stage.